Hello, everyone. My name is Jen Lashansky. I am the Chief Engagement Officer at Be Social Change, one of the partner organizations that is hosting tonight's event, along with the incredible folks at Impact Hub, New York metropolitan area. We are incredibly grateful to our fantastic panelists this evening for joining us and sharing their insights on the topic of unpacking the privilege in purpose. This is a conversation that's really near and dear to the heart of our work at Be Social Change. We are a community that's dedicated to helping every person make their greatest impact. And we know that there's many layers involved in that, right? Our model involves be, social, and change. That's very intentionally be equating to the personal development that we do in order to make an impact. Social, looking at the social dynamics and building cooperative, inclusive networks in order to advance specific issue areas, and change being actually taking action in an area where you can contribute and have the skills and knowledge to do so. We're really grateful to be partnering with Impact Hub, who I'm going to turn it over to in just a moment. And wanted to say that if you are interested in learning a little bit more about the work at Be Social Change and some of the weekly events that we host on different social impact topics or workshops or webinars, check us out at besocialchange.com. You can check out our calendar, besocialchange.com/calendar. I'll post some links in the chat. And we hope to see you again at another event. I also want to give a shout out to all the members who are on this call, of whom I see many. Feel free to say hi in the chat, y'all. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to the incredible Chandani from Impact Hub, who's going to kick off our conversation and be our talented moderator tonight.
Thank you, Jen. Hi, everyone. I'm Chandani Punia. I work at the intersection of human-centered design and social change. I want to tell you a little bit about Impact Hub. I'm an advisor to this wonderful organization. Impact Hub New York metropolitan area supports entrepreneurs and change makers through programs designed to have impactful ideas succeed and find a home. We work broadly across the New York metropolitan area with a focus in Manhattan, Queens, Newark, and Morristown, New Jersey. Impact Hub is a global association of entrepreneurial communities in more than 100 cities and 50 countries. We're really happy to partner with Be Social Change on this event. It has really been our intention to create a virtual series of convenings to provide resources to communities and unpack conversations like we will today. So thank you so much for joining us. Before we do the Q&A with this lovely panel, we wanted to do things a little bit different. So we will actually split everyone here into smaller groups. And then once you're in your groups, I have 3 asks. The first is, please take about 15 seconds or so just to say your name, where you work, and what you do. And then in the time remaining, I'd really like you all to kind of talk about what purpose and privilege means to you. So you'll have about 10 minutes total to do that. We might not get through everything, but that's okay. We just kind of want to get warmed up and get your different perspectives on this topic, because it is such a big topic with different ways in which we interact with purpose and privilege in our own lived experience. So we'll break up into separate rooms. We'll come back to this room where I will have a series of questions for the panelists, but we'd really like everyone to participate and chat. If there's any interesting ideas that came up in your Zoom breakout rooms, please share those. I will be picking up questions from all of you, and we'll do that about for 45 minutes. And then in the end, we'll really try to leave with some tangible ideas on how to make a change. So I'll pass it on to Jen and Archana to split everyone into rooms.
That is all Archana. And I think when she's ready, she's going to let us know.
Okay, so just a reminder, when we're in our rooms, name what you do, where you work, 15 seconds really quick, and then what does purpose and privilege mean to you? If you can kind of popcorn style share that in your breakout rooms, that would be great. So while everyone is typing in chat, maybe I'll just start this conversation with a round of introductions. So Rakiba, why don't I start with you? If you can, share who you are, what you do, and how your work connects with this topic. And you're on mute, by the way.
Sure.
There you are.
Hi, everyone. It's so great to be here, despite Mars and Mercury and everything working against us, leading up to Election Day, too, nonetheless. I'm Rakiba Kibriya. I'm the Director of Advancement at Common Future. Actually, before I get started, acknowledging that Monday was Indigenous Peoples Day, and this is a unique conversation on purpose and privilege, I just want to take a moment and acknowledge the territory I'm currently occupying, which is Rockaway, because I am in Hollis, Queens. And that's unique, just saying that out loud, and the dynamic has changed over the years where a lot of us know what Indigenous Peoples Day is. So again, I'm Rakiba Kibriya. I'm the Director of Advancement at Common Future, which is a national think and do tank, closing the racial wealth gap by driving attention and investment to BIPOC, rural, working class immigrant leaders across the country. So we're really working to rebuild an equitable economy alongside these leaders. And we're doing so by driving investments to them and their alternative approaches to keep community wealth. Purpose and privilege is very interesting because I sit in a fundraising role, so I know the lens that carries because I'm not working directly with the communities, nor on the programmatic side, but in fact, I'm working with wealth and power. So over the course of the last 20 years, and I've only been with the organization for 3, we've already shifted around $250 million in philanthropic and investment capital to community investment. And by doing that specifically through power building activities, and I know power's come up a couple of times in the chat. So I'm really glad to be here. Thank you so much. Popcorning, passing it on to Max. Cool.
Wow. Okay. My name is Max Skolnick. I'm one of the founding partners of Generation Titans. We are a social impact firm that was born out of our collective. There's 3 partners, and we all worked at the My Brother's Keeper initiative, which later became part of the Obama Foundation. We were really excited and passionate about entrepreneurship and social innovation that was happening in our work there, and we decided to carry it forward on our own in this firm where we focus specifically on Black, Latinx, and Indigenous founders. How do we drive more resources, more financing to them? We just launched our singular platform. It's called Reunion. The idea of being, let's create a new family reunion, a new family and friend space for these founders. It's a crowdfunding and community platform where folks can amplify stories, they can validate tactics, and they can raise unrestricted funding. And we're super excited. We're doing work in 3 different communities at the moment: in Albuquerque with some really amazing Indigenous founders, in Austin with some health and wellness solutions, and we have a national one that does software as a service solutions in the D&I space. So happy to be here. Excited to talk more. Passing it on to Jorge.
Modeling Rakiba. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm chiming in on Zoom from Lenape land, and am so grateful to be part of this session as well. I come from a very similar perspective, I think, as Max and Rakiba, both as a marketing strategy consultant. So again, my name is Jorge Fontanes. I founded Marca Studio. I'm the CEO and founder. A lot of my role has been focused on advising founders of social enterprises, mainly early stage, and very interested in the importance of helping founders gain access to expertise as much as capital. Knowing that those of us who get access to capital certainly helps, but also getting access to advisors or mentorship can help a business exceed the 10-year survival rate by about 70%. In my capacity, I also teach at the Bard MBA in Sustainability program. So I teach a program, a course called Stakeholders in Marketing. And the thinking there is that brands can no longer account for just how they serve customers, but how they how their equity and value chain is impacted by all stakeholders, by employees who are increasingly using their voice to create social environmental change, but also suppliers, investors, and the community writ large. And so all of this is what inspires my work and inspires me and inspires my work. And yeah, it's great to be here.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for sharing your perspectives on purpose and privilege. There's some interesting ways in which you've articulated it. I'd like to turn it over to our panelists. So in your words, if you could kind of tell us how you define privilege and purpose. And maybe, Jorge, I can start with you this time.
Sure, thanks. Just always seeking my mute button. I'll answer this question by crediting Aaron Hurst. His book on the purpose economy actually has informed me and my thinking about how we think about purpose, particularly within the BART MBA program, where many of our students are asking fundamental questions about what does purpose really mean and how do I manifest purpose in my life? And what I think Aaron Hurst does a really good job of doing in his book is helping us articulate that purpose can happen at any level. It can be in our daily lives. It can be in our families. It can be as parents, as caregivers. It can also be at an organizational level. It can also be at a systems level, right? And so for many of us, that might manifest in what we like to do in terms of our day-to-day. Are we more of an introvert versus an extrovert? We often think about that as how we decide what our career path is. And so I think Aaron offers a really good way for us to build self-awareness about what purpose means for us, how it energizes us. And I think also, if I were to expand on this definition, I think purpose requires us to take on systems thinking, whether or not we're working at a systems level or at an individual level, that we look at how our agency connects with that of institutions and structures, in particular, that have been historically racialized. And I know we'll talk more about equity in this conversation about privilege and purpose, but I do think opening up the conversation to talk about purpose allows us to have these institutions and systems be more accessible, potentially, despite whether or not we have or feel that we have privilege.
Thank you. I really love that systems level view of purpose and privilege. Max, would you like to give us your perspectives?
Sure. And like Jorge, I always have to remember to unmute. So it's like the bane. I think in many ways, I'm just sort of echoing what Jorge is saying is, for me, purpose, I remember thinking a while back, I'd read Viktor Frankl's Search for Meaning. I don't know if folks have read that book. It's classic, And it really struck me, this sort of idea of meaning and purpose in life and how it animates and drives us from the individual level. And for those of you who don't know, it's sort of his experience in the concentration camps, the Nazi concentration camps, and he was a psychiatrist and was like counseling his fellow prisoners, many of whom were for obvious reasons suicidal, and like how do you find purpose in the worst possible conditions. And some folks would think about the book they wanted to finish writing when they left, or the child they wanted to reunite with, and that brought them purpose. So to me, it was the sort of pursuit of why and that drive to keep you going. And I think what's changed over time for me is the more communitarian or systemic approach that maybe Jorge is talking about, that purpose is derived from others or connection to others, which has, tons of literature from a religious perspective, from a social perspective. There was even this really cool book I read a review of a book. So this is like my classic thing of trying to be an expert on a book that I read a review of. It was Eugenia Chang's. It's a new book that came out called X plus Y. I don't know if folks have seen it recently, but this idea of sort of ingressive versus congressive behaviors, and she's sort of using them to non-gender behaviors. Ingressive are like what we typically think of as male behaviors, competitive, out for yourself, sort of that drive, versus congressive, which are more communitarian or quote unquote female. It's like, how do we sort of degender these things? And the idea of sort of congressive, communitarian, purpose-driven work like really sort of resonated with me. and I think, and it's at the same point, like if you're talking about community in America, you talk about the racialization of it, and how that just seeps into everything to sort of to further Jorge's point. In terms of privilege, to me, it's power. Right? Privilege is power. Privilege is a series of stacked advantages that folks have gotten in their own lives, and then generationally. I always tell this story, like I would not be here today if not for the fact that my grandfather bought a house in the 1950s. Right, and he was the child of immigrants, but because of his whiteness, he had advantages. Even though we're Jewish, he had a horrible experience. Him growing up, I'm telling the stories, but like that was unthinkable for my parents or for me to like struggle as a Jew in America. But when he bought that house, that set forward a domino effect of wealth and generational wealth, not massive, but that my parents went to college and I went to college. And so I think like thinking about privilege in this way, that it's not only current, it's historical. And we have such amnesia and ignorance about the history in this country, which we can certainly get into, because I'm a total history nerd and I love sort of understanding these. I think that's just a huge part of like how privilege operates today.
Yeah, I think that's really valuable. And there's something that I read and I thought it really resonated with me, was that often with privilege, those that are privileged don't recognize the privilege that they are born with, but it's painfully visible to those that are on the margins. So, I think the way we're defining privilege in terms of race, wealth, gender, or identity, but then there's an aspect of that which is just not acknowledging the privilege that you have and how it affects the societies and communities that you're within. So, I like the sort of the historical sort of drivers of privilege, who has access to pursue their purpose is connected to privilege. I see a lot of comments in the chat that are kind of connecting purpose and privilege and the mean. So somebody here said, Michael said, purpose and privilege for me means the ability to provision sustainable co-creation with people and industry. And I think that to me resonates from a human-centered design approach. It's kind of connecting purpose with privilege, but then also sharing that privilege with people you are designing solutions for and not having them be on the margins. So there's a lot to unpack about how this intersects with our work, and I'll get to that in a second. But Rakiba, do you want to share what these terms mean to you?
Sure. Piggybacking off of everything Jorge and Max said, I think purpose is one's North Star, really like the guiding light that gives you energy, motivation, and helps you focus and stay charged, even in the most trying times like what we're facing today. And from an individual level, that's really been raising my 15-month-old daughter. From a communal level, it's showing up for my rather large Bangladeshi family and community in different ways, and helping them even actualize their power, their purpose, and their privilege. So that's been really rewarding in the last year, I want to say. And then professionally, purpose for me has changed in the last few years by what I do and how I show up at work. And what I mean by that is, for over a decade, I've really focused my career in fundraising for human services, so direct service nonprofits, often youth focused, incarcerated young people, foster care, you name it, right? And while they were really great in everything that they were doing, one of the reasons that I joined Common Future is understanding that we can't approach things we care about in silos. And so what mattered to me is, ameliorating poverty for marginalized youth, right? But organizations that I worked for previously were just tackling a facet of that rather than looking at it from the systems level. And my current job now, so I'm continuously interrogating purpose of our work at large, which is creating a future where people, no matter their race, ethnicity, or wealth, have power, choice, and ownership over the economy, and really seeing if our daily actions mimic that, and if my fundraising interactions specifically live that value and champion those community voices. So privilege, what it boils down to is the advantage that you personally have by birth, by society, by income, by skin color, or professionally from the role and position that you sit at, and the social and financial capitals you have, right? That allows you to exert more power in your daily life. And as a fundraiser, I'm in this unique position. And really, I'll be very frank, I've only shifted my mindset around all of these in the last 3 years. It's a constant unlearning and relearning process. So as a fundraiser, I see myself really as a steward of trust. So trust from the communities that I fundraise for, and also the trust of the donors whose philanthropic efforts and values that I'm helping to bring to life, right? So fundamentally now, like our worldview has evolved to meet the moment in history we're in. And like Jorge, like Max, I can't stress enough that we can't ignore the role structural racism plays in who the economy works for, who it leaves out, and what each of us from our power, capacity, and ultimately privilege can do to remedy, repair, heal centuries worth of extraction, exploitation, and trauma, even though we haven't directly added to any of those. All of us are complicit in some way or another.
Thank you. And I think we're sort of going into the space where we can boil down some of these concepts into how they intersect with our daily lives. And arguably, each of you are doing something that's addressing a very tangible problem in the way that purpose and privilege show up in our daily lives, whether that's trying to make access to resources more inclusive, whether it's trying to elevate voices that are not normally heard in program design and implementation. So I'd really like for each of you to maybe give like a tangible example of a way in which this poses to be a problem, and how you, either in your current roles or in your personal lives, try to address it. And maybe we can start with Max.
The questions are like what barriers are out there in terms of this privilege piece. Yeah.
And how you tried to solve some of those challenges.
Yeah, I mean, for me, there are so many, right? I mean, to untangle privilege, which is just a nicer way of saying racism, right? Or structured racism. There's the systemic barriers, which I think, right, are maybe evident to many, but not to all, which is 400 years of systems that have accumulated by design to deny service and access to people, right? These are not by accidents. The highway system in Atlanta is racist because it was designed to curve around Black and white neighborhoods, right? And we wonder today, like, why is it so inefficient? And like, why don't we have, and this is all like 1619 project, right? So you all folks add that to the reading list of stuff, right? Why don't we have, why is there, when Social Security was first created, why was it exempt? Why were farm workers and domestic workers exempted? Because those were largely Black professions, maids and sharecroppers. And it was through the white segregationist Democratic senators who were like, we're not going to have our hard-earned benefits go to Black folks, right? And it took the Great Society step in Johnson to correct that. But there's still like all those systemic things, like why does the SBA still disproportionately deny loans to Black and brown folks, like 95% Black folks, 91% in this year, and like in COVID, right? So all that stuff. And I think, our approach to that is sort of like creating alternative economies, creating new spaces. And this is not from me, it's like, from the entrepreneurs that we work with. There's an incredible woman, Vanessa Roanhorse, we work with in Albuquerque, who said this in a room. She's like, we don't want to sit at the table, we want a new table, right? The table is rotten. We don't want anything to do with that table. And so that idea of creating these new spaces for funding, for capital raising, for resource sharing feels like a systemic approach. And then you have the interpersonal barriers, the microaggression nonsense, the white bros in Silicon Valley don't get the Black female product. Like, I don't get it, right? Like that kind of bullshit that just is like all throughout the system, that kind of poison that I don't know how to draw that out, right? That's going to take generations of re-education on people who are also disconnected from the systemic approaches. And I think some of it is like fighting stereotypes that we do in our work. And when folks think about Indigenous founders, it's not just, it's like it doesn't all have to be environmental or back to the land or food, right? Like we have these sort of the noble savage stereotypes, that there are folks, they're gamers, they're like cool comic book creators in the indigenous communities. Like those to me feel like counter programming, counter narrative to some of those interpersonal things. And then like super quick, because I know like the cultural historical pieces are obviously just hugely profound. And I think in two ways, like one, like we don't know our own history. We're just super ignorant. I mean, whether it's Tulsa and, we're learning about it through Lovecraft Country and Watchmen, but like go to Tulsa and see how burnt out it is still to this day. Like, I've been to Tulsa and it's horrible. Greenwood and like none of it's there. It's all gone, right? Or the Bisbee deportation or the Wilmington riot. It's like there are all kinds of things in our history that where white people have, again, intentionally destroyed Black and brown and indigenous excellence. And we don't know. And so we wonder why these things are broken today. It's like we broke them. Like white people broke them. And they don't even know that, or they pretend not to know they did it, right? And then the last thing, cultural, I'll say is like, I remember having this conversation with my father, who's a great, wonderful, progressive guy. And he's just like, I don't understand privilege. It's just not hard work, and I was like, you don't understand that when, as a white person growing up in America, your conception of normalcy is whiteness. Even probably for many people of color, if you ask them, when you think of a normal American family, what do you think? Oh, I think of like a white family in Ohio. No offense to folks in Ohio, with a white picket fence, and they're sitting down for dinner, right? We all have this like, Madison Avenue view of what is normal. And we need to unskew that, right? We need to can change that entire cultural perspective of like, what is the new normal? What is the new majority? What is the new emerging power in this country? And so I don't know how to, again, these are things that we're addressing sort of through our work and some messaging and amplification and partnering and collaboration. But to me, it's movement work.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I think a lot of what you're saying, the common thread is just acknowledging that there's a problem, understanding how the problem was created, and then working with that to find a solution. And something you said about, preference for a certain type of race or color. There's the Harvard Implicit Association. It's a good resource. There's a lot of, controversy about how accurate the test is, but it measures your implicit bias. And actually 45% of, it was like 4 million, a test of 4 million survey takers, of which 45% indicated a preference for white people over people of color. And this 45% was actually Black people. So it's so ingrained even in the minds of people of color that, it's going to take a lot of work and acknowledging our own biases. And not just for white people, there's a lot of problems with racial bias in South Asian communities as well. So I think that, I think step number one is acknowledging that there's a problem. I want to turn it over to Jorge. What are your thoughts?
Yes, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree that we need to start by acknowledging the issues where privilege and purpose might also be a wide gap for folks. And I want to actually start by centering the voice of Ada Maria Isasi Diaz. She is a womanist theologian, and she says about humility, which I think is just one of these tenets that we, as we think about any kind of change, especially systems change, and especially with respect to movement making, as Max has suggested, and addressing racial injustice. She says humility is not a matter of self-effacement and self-negation, but of being open always to new ways of being responsible. And I wanted to share that quote because it actually has informed the work and my course at the BARD MBA program. It was personally very difficult for me to think about what it would mean to start the semester in August after, while being in this pandemic, which is still ongoing for all of us globally, and with so much uncertainty about what does it mean to even invest in an MBA program right now, and then of course with the movements that we're seeing, the Black Lives Matter movement, really putting in front of us daily. You know, so many activists really doing the work to ensure that Black lives are not forgotten and centering this issue of police brutality. And so I share that example also because I think it's important for us in institutions like MBA programs, right? We are also have a responsibility to understand how we shape narratives. I think we have a particular advantage because we are a smaller program. We're more agile than, I'll just say, larger legacy MBA programs that are just difficult to move, even on conversations of, forget about social justice, even on conversations of climate change and ESG and accounting for externalities of business and ensuring that business also takes responsibility for extractive resources that make their businesses possible. And so I think it's true that we need to acknowledge our history and then also bring this truth to the forefront and bring different diverse voices to the fore, to really be conscientious about how we center dominant ideologies that tend to be white men. And that is even hard for someone like me. You mentioned, Chandani, the IAT. I will share personally, yes, I tested, I'm an Afro-Latinx queer person and cis male. And, when I took the IAT, it was revealing because it also showed a preference to white people in terms of how our brains are wired. But why is that? Media plays into that. My social trusted spheres of influences, all of my educational background, if you look, we're majority white institutions. And so, so acknowledging that individually is significant. And it's part of the work that leads to systems change.
Thank you. I'll hand it over to you, Rakiba.
Awesome. I think the biggest challenge for me in the realm of philanthropy, impact investing, fundraising is getting folks to the basic acknowledgement that people of color, especially Black people, have been operate in a lens of survival, a mode of survival, period. When you operate from a mode of survival, things are already set up against you, So even my progressive funders that fund systems change, the Black Lives Matter movement, liberatory philanthropy practices, they're still enacting metrics, procedural norms, the thing that they want to affect impact in from a lens of discrimination. It's discriminatory by design, So I love one of MLK's quotes in a sermon that he gave in 1963, which says, "Philanthropy is commendable, but it must not cause the philanthropist to overlook the circumstances of economic injustice which make philanthropy necessary." And that highlights a central contradiction, right? The contradiction that philanthropy is a creature of our market system, and there's unequal benefits, and yet it's charged with addressing the very prejudice, exploitation, and the issues that it's perpetuated, right? So at the end of the day, one of the hardest things for me is really to practice, preach, and enroll donors that I'm working with to look at philanthropy from not a place of benevolence, from a place of charity that rewards them by giving up their wealth, but actually interrogating with them, well, how is it that you've accumulated this wealth, right? And at whose expense? And having done so, what are you doing now to illuminate and advance the work from the privilege in which you sit, So I think that's super, super, there's a lot of philanthropists and a lot of donors that respond really well to it. And yet there are others where, again, they're moderate and or left-leaning progressive funders that can't seem to piece it all together. That, as a wealthy person, they have multiple financial vehicles in which they exert their values, right? Philanthropy being one of them. But, and they can give out to a venture capital and expect 75% failure rate. And yet it's so hard for them to really give and trust communities of color to enact even a fraction of that wealth, right? That's telling. That's telling, because if a community like the Black community is constantly expected to operate from a mode of survival, and now you're putting standards for it to go beyond what normal standards are for a white community, and on top of that, like, you know, you're saying that no, you can't take risk, you can't fail, no, you can't fail, you can't take risk. So what it does is it just perpetuates just systems that discourage ingenuity, creativity, and innovation, and this is like decades and centuries worth of harm being done when you keep perpetuating those beliefs, even from well-intentioned, well-meaning places, like being a white progressive donor.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. There's a Stanford did a study in 2019 that indicates, and this is no surprise, that investors have a preference for white entrepreneurs as opposed to entrepreneurs of color. And in fact, you even see it in gender, where the types of questions they will ask a male entrepreneur is, in what ways do you hope to succeed or scale this venture? And the question asked to female entrepreneurs is, how do you make sure that you are not going to fail? So, you know, even outside of sort of philanthropy work, even if we look at impact investing and investing in profitable or soon to be profitable companies, the problem is, again, you know, as we've all talked about, it's a systems level. It's sort of ingrained in our mindsets and bias. There's like extreme fatigue in communities of colors having to show up, ask for funding, and explain why they will be successful when their counterparts are not sort of faced with that same experience. I want to get into a little bit of the topic of accountability and authenticity. There's a lot of comments here as well that say there's a role for business to be accountable to this. And I'm going to take that to mean to the extent that there's not so much dissonance between purpose and privilege, that there are equitable systems so that everyone can pursue purpose-driven work regardless of privilege. And that's, you know, recognizing that that's an ideal state. So maybe we can talk a little bit about what that means. For me, how that topic resonates is that even when we talk about sort of social impact organizations or NGOs, something that really sticks to me is there authenticity? So if there is an organization that's working to alleviate poverty, how are you paying your employees? Are there spaces? Is there safety? Is there psychological safety for your staff? How do you show up to meetings with investors or donors? So there's, for me, that a lot of this is at the institutional level. Is there accountability? Because I think there's a tendency for organizations to carry purpose-driven work as if it's also a reflection of how things are managed internally. And that's often not the case. So I want to talk to you a little bit about how that feels for you when you think about, you know, a responsibility of corporations or organizations or institutions. What does that mean? And how do you think they can be held more accountable to this? So whoever wants to start.
I can start. So when you ask this question about accountability, it is specifically to business stakeholders, right? Is, I think, your question and how you're framing it. I mean, this is a fundamental question that we're exploring in the MBA program when we understand that we are living in a global marketplace and how dependent we are to cheap labor in particular. And so just to try and bridge this conversation, sounds like someone might need to mute themselves. If we want to bridge this conversation around history, we can understand quickly that many global companies with complex supply chains still operate on slave labor. We call this modern slavery today, and it looks different than it did 400 years ago. But the mechanisms for how individual rights get taken out individual rights are taken away, and we've seen instances of many brands unfortunately being on the receiving end of this. The chocolate makers actually are still dealing with this issue. Large global brands, if you do your research, you will see are having difficulties with achieving zero modern slavery in their supply chains for cocoa, but might be able to do it in seafood. And there are all these interesting dynamics about why you can do it for one industry versus another. And so, yes, we are increasingly connected today digitally, but I think there's also an acknowledgement as we become more aware of how businesses are operating that, in fact, we have not been able to evolve business models to a point where human lives are not paying the cost that allow us to live better and to live with privilege.
I can go next. Oh, go ahead, Rakiba. Sorry, you unmuted.
Oh, thank you. I think when it boils down to accountability for whether you're a corporation, whether you're a nonprofit, whether you are a foundation and an individual philanthropist, it has to answer the question, well, are all elements of your organization expressing the values and the mission that you state out there in the world? Right. And what I mean by that is, so if you're a foundation and, you know, you're helping young people, you're fighting, you're advocating for criminal justice reform, et cetera, but that's only 5% of your expressed values through grant making, and then 95% of your wealth is actually invested into private prisons or other industries, you can no longer say those two are in alignment, right? So for corporations specifically, I think the very systems upon which everything is built is being questioned because the world's on fire and everything's turned upside down. Even so, it's great that corporations pledge, I think now it's $4.1 billion towards racial equity. But while before, I want to say even 2-3 years ago, it would be a good PR value. Now there's active conversations about, well, how did those billions come about? You know, and how are those billions being invested? And is it even perhaps further cushioning the very corporation's bottom line? Those things, I think, are in the limelight now and are being held to fire. And it's going to continue going this direction. And that gives me hope towards accountability because those things were not things that ever came into the mainstream before.
I think for me, 10,000 years ago, I was pursuing a failed PhD in truth and reconciliation. that was my topic. And it was in South America and South Africa. I looked at the South African, which is the more famous Truth Commission under Desmond Tutu, but also there's a Chilean model, Argentine model. And to me, it's accountable for what, right? Accountable for truth, accountable for reconciliation, and in my mind also accountable for repair. And I think back on the truth side, there's never been obviously a reckoning in this country, right? If you are a company that existed before the Civil War, banking, insurance, you did work with slaves. You did, right? That's a fact. If you're in a university, not to call out names, but if your university existed before 1860, you had trustees that were slave holders. You had who were slave traders, all manner of stuff, right? And so and then companies that were dispossessed native peoples, timber companies in Minnesota and the Red Lake Reservation, or the railroads that still exist today. There are companies that exist today that employ people that have a history that has never been reckoned with, right? And so to me, that's step one, is we've never had a cathartic, true experience where we've gotten all this out and had companies, institutions, philanthropy take responsibility for that. I mean, Rakiba talked about it's look, philanthropy started as largely social control. The robber barons got together and be like, we don't want people rioting in the streets. We don't want our workers going crazy. So let's give them a little charity so they don't turn this into a socialist country, right? And like, that was the history there. And like, there's definitely something, I know Ford Foundation's had some reckoning with this, and they talked about, that history. And then like the next step for companies, and I'm in the reconciliation piece, like doing the hard, true work of understanding how race and gender and all of these things have affected the way you operate, the values, we're keeping some of the values you bring to this work, and how that's lived every day, right? I mean, that hasn't happened, or it has happened in many ways in a surface level. Like, let's put up a Black Lives Matter avatar on our freaking social media and call it a day, right? And call that a success. And then the repair work is like never done, right? I mean, like, that's a systemic, like, whether you want to call it reparations, whether you want to call it social programs, whatever you like, we need to, as a country and as companies, as the economic sector, we're all complicit in this. And that was, I think, the beauty of the Truth Commission in South Africa, was that it's not just security forces, it's not just the military, it's the churches, right, in South Africa. It's the community groups that turned a blind eye. It's the political parties that accepted it. And we have that same. We're not that different from apartheid South Africa. In many ways, worse, right? I mean, they model a lot of stuff on our work. And so to me, it's like going through that very difficult process of truth and reconciliation and repair is what I hope companies can be, or anybody, institutions for that matter, can be held accountable to.
Thank you. And, to take it even a step further, maybe I'd like each of you to share some resources that can be useful. We have about 44 people on this call, and I'm surprised that there are no questions. So we have 10 minutes left. So everyone, please send in your questions. But yeah, if each of you can share some sort of, resource that we can take away from this time together. And maybe I can start. I think for me, I think that, the Harvard, the implicit bias test that I mentioned, I think is a really good starting point to kind of acknowledge your own role and journey. Because at the end of the day, institutions are just a group and collections of people. So I think just starting with some own personal work is valuable. I practice human-centered design, and a lot of that is about creating a safe space where voices that have generally been marginalized have the floor and freedom to express themselves. It's not so easy to do within institutions or as an institution serving in a consulting role for like a global development challenge. But just kind of acknowledging that, people come from different walks of life, and how you show up in a room or in a meeting day to day, don't expect that, your colleague has the same sort of psychological safety in the workplace. Understand first where they're coming from, because sometimes, even in the good sort of will to learn more about how people on the margins are experiencing hardships or challenges, there's an assumption that people are comfortable sharing or they feel safe sharing. So I think, just kind of leaning on tools that can help you approach these conversations with some sort of sensitivity, I think is valuable. And while everybody else is talking, I can drop some resources to tangible toolkits in our chat. But maybe I can pass it over to Rakiba.
Yeah, sure. I think at the heart of all of this and power, privilege, purpose is really looking inward at yourself, but also at community and applying almost a community organizing lens to everything that you're doing. And in doing that, I assure you'll come across remarkable BIPOC leaders whose traditional career paths nor organizations really mimic your CSR kind of pedagogy, but they're walking the walk and living each day to create a more equitable society by doing their purposeful work. And we almost miss them, and I think personally, start from your own place of power and privilege and assess if you're leading a purposeful life, the kind of impact you want to be creating beyond yourself. And if there's something missing, how can you address that? And in terms of resources, really one of the books that's really shaped my view in all of this, I think it's called Blind Spots, Hidden Biases of Good People. That's been a pivotal book for me personally. And then if you're in philanthropy and you're in the nonprofit world, I strongly, strongly encourage you to read what Jorge also posted in the chat, Decolonizing Wealth by Edgar Villanueva, and then Winners Take All by Anand Giridharadas. I'm probably mispronouncing that. But yeah.
I'll add to those recommendations, Rakiba, just to say I put in the chat a resource for Just Capital. A couple of folks are asking about how commercial enterprises are embedding, at least I see one question about privilege and purpose. I think that's manifesting in what is commonly known as ESG framework, so environmental, social, and governance. And what Just Capital is doing, I think so well, is that they are helping business leaders, CEOs in particular, get to the metrics that are potentially the toughest to measure, and looking at a multi-stakeholder approach to that measurement. So if you take a look at their rankings, you'll see that they are evaluating companies on how they treat their employees, how they treat their suppliers, in addition to their bottom line. And so what they're also doing is hosting quarterly just calls. So whereas the earnings call has become the mantra of business for Wall Street, they're really trying to shape the narrative so that we can talk more about these other elements and factors that impact business day to day.
I'll say for me, just to echo everything, I think it's hard for me, to be honest, as a white person, like sort of talking about here's what I think should happen, right? I want to, and I think like to recenter or decenter my voice and recenter voices like Joey Womack, who I mentioned in Atlanta for Goody Nation, or Vanessa Runhorst, or HBC VC, which is doing all that kind of investment work that is run by people of color. And my company is, and I'm the one white guy. So I think it's important to like look at those sources, but also again from the historical perspective, what was eye-opening for me is like being sort of a voracious reader is like understanding where, again, so our country's been. So like books like The Burning, I don't know if you've heard of it, it sort of talks about the Tulsa massacre. And you understand like the level of Black excellence and wealth that was created in Tulsa prior to its destruction. Or I'm also reading this book, The Heartbeat of Wounded Knee, which picks up where Dee Brown's book left off with Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and sort of like what happened after the Indian Wars that we think of. Like how did Native Americans persevere through the treaty period and the boarding school period and the Dawes Act and all the allotments. And like, again, there's like such incredible, like, I think as a white person, for white people to understand, like we think of these as such deficit-based approaches that like Black people couldn't have, ever have created wealth, or Native Americans could never have had this independence. When they did, they had these things, they were taken away from them. And it can happen again, and it will happen again. And so I think like understanding that trajectory has been really important for me, and I hope folks can share in that too. I just think like that grounding in both history, but also love and empathy, and seeing this from a relational perspective. So much of this is generational trauma, that has never been addressed in a community way. We think of generational trauma like, oh, let's just get mental health services to people. Like we don't think about mental health services to a community, like in its entirety. These things didn't happen in the past; they happened yesterday. They happen today. And I think for many who are living this, whether it was their great-great-grandparents or their today, it's like the experience is still lived, it's still happening now, it's being re-traumatized. So.
Thank you for sharing. We have time for just one question because we have 2 minutes left. There's a question around, so when you have the privilege to work for purpose, and they're defining privilege as access to funds, let's say, where do you start to make sure that your work is purposeful?
I can go because I answer these for funders all the time. I think first, look at your docket. Who's on your docket? How did they come to be on your docket? The projects, the people, the organizations. Then I guess look at, well, how can you broaden the lens of your docket? Number one, right? And then one of the things I hate being a fundraiser and about philanthropy, but I'm in this love-hate relationship with my own career, is the procedural norms and formalities that are out there. Why? I am fortunate enough to be in an organization that we can dedicate resources to a fundraising person and a grant writer and all of that. Most BIPOC-led organizations out there, there's 1.5 million charities in the United States. 1 million of that are under $500,000. And guess who leads all of that? They don't have dedicated staff. So when you impose RFPs, letter of intent, and reporting, and this, and metrics, they're all white. They're all white standards. Don't do that. Don't put that labor on your organization and who you're working with to do that kind of work. Make it as simple as possible for them, and also trust them. Trust them through transparent conversations. Trust them that they know their communities well to do the work, and you just have to be in partnership with them and figure out how to get the projects, get the initiatives up and going. And at the end of it too, I think if you're in a place of power, wealth, and a CSR, you also have to look at what power do you have internally in your organization. So if you're noticing something in your docket of projects and pool of candidates to give out to, but don't see internal mechanisms within your institution to also make actionable those values, elevate more things, figure out who you need to talk to, what needs to happen to really change the CSR, division of your company too. And that starts looking at it internally.
I was just in awe of and so grateful for Rakiba's reminder of the value of trust in our systems. I mean, trust is at all-time lows. Edelman's Trust Barometer measures trust annually. We are at a critical point, and I think it is a big reason why culture, within organizations, gets pointed to as the root cause of why businesses in particular, but organizations writ large, whether you're for-profit or not-for-profit, are not great spaces for people of color. And so how do we rebuild that trust, I think is very much an important part of the conversation.
So many final thoughts. And I love this conversation, and I wish we could go on for another 3 hours. And, I put my email in the chat if folks want to reach out and have this conversation further. I'll just say, to me, that final thought is just like what I always try to do, and I hope we can all just sort of lead with that empathy and lead with that heart and lead with that love. And I think there's so much really important work to do. And like for me, at least, like understanding, like I remember thinking back to the work I did in Argentina with families that disappeared, or in Albuquerque with teen, boys and young men of Native communities who are dealing with teen suicide. Like it's not a policy thing for them. It's not a problem to be solved, right? It's emotional, and it's in their family and in their blood. And so I think that's always just been really a critical North Star for me. It's just how do we just sort of lead with our heart and remember that this is a lifetime of work.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time and all the resources. Thank you everyone who joined this conversation. We will look through all the chat and share. It sounds like all the speakers are comfortable sharing their email information, so maybe you can just share that together with all the resources. But thank you so much. It's a very big conversation to unpack in 1 hour, but we hope that the Social Change and Impact Hub can continue to create a space for us to have these conversations. So thank you so much, everyone, for your time. And I'll leave it to the Zoom gods to end this meeting.